Let me introduce Dave Gaddis. This is it, folks. We are in the final stretch. He's going to bring us home. Dave Gaddis is currently serving as interim planning director for the city of Bastrop, Texas. He was deputy city manager for the city of Benbrook, close to me, a suburban community of 22,000 on the southwest side of Fort Worth, Texas, until his retirement in December of 2016. Mr. Gaddis was responsible for planning, engineering, building inspection, capital improvements, geographic information systems, public works, information technology, and economic development activities in the city. He was also a member of Benbrook's Task Increment Finance District Board of Directors. How much more do you want me to tell them?
That's funny.
Is that good? Because I could go forever. But at any rate, we're going to let you bring us home. How about that? Please help me welcome Dave Gaddis.
I guess the important thing to remember, we've heard from the public health folks, we've heard from academic folks. My lens is as a city manager, city planner person. So I'm looking at the public sector, small town, and all of those things that I was responsible for is because, I was small town. You end up doing a lot of things. I'm going to talk mainly about post-disaster recovery. Slightly different than what some of you may be interested in, but I might also talk a little bit about some of the response activities because we are familiar with that. Question came up about cell service. Your cell carriers have mobile cell units, and if you know the contact, how to get a hold of them, they can bring those truck-mounted cell units in to provide some service while you're dealing with that. Well, I've got to talk a little bit about what Bastrop is. I guess I'm the guy from out of town, not as far as Chicago, but sort of far, about a couple hundred miles away. Established in 1832. Republic of Texas was 1836, so we predate the Republic of Texas. So it's an old town, still has a lot of old character downtown Main Street. Most people know it as the Lost Pines. You've got the East Texas Piney Woods. Well, there's this kind of isolated area called the Lost Pines around Bastrop, which is kind of one of our claims to fame. It's located on the Colorado River. It's on the El Camino Real, the old San Antonio Road. All of those things kind of went through Bastrop. That's where they crossed the Colorado River. It's mainly arts and tourism at this point in time in terms of, in old days it was lumber and cotton and all those other things, but right now people go for arts and tourism and drinking, I think. Bastrop State Park is there. A lot of the buildings there were built in the 30s by CCC, so there's kind of an interesting character there, and I'll talk a little bit more about the state park when we start talking about the fire. And we're also the home to an endangered species, the Houston toad. So as part of my planning activities, I've got to worry about what effect it's going to have on the Houston toad. Have 8,500 people in town on a permanent basis. It's a relatively small town, a large extraterritorial jurisdiction. And these are there's 9 square miles in town. We've got another 20 square miles of annexation agreements. Our standard 1 mile ETJ is about 28 or 29 square miles. And then we've got an additional 125 square miles of people in Bastrop County who wanted to be part of us because they didn't want mean old Austin coming and getting them. So we have a very large jurisdiction that we have to deal with. So other than the people who are worried about the conspiracy of the federal government taking over by military force as part of Jade Helm a couple of years ago, most people know us as fires and floods. So the big fire was the 2011 Bastrop County Complex fire. It was actually 3 different fires. It started on September 4th, and Tropical Storm Lee was going through. And those winds kind of whipped up the fires, and it's kind of hard to see the scale here, but Bastrop is right there, and then that whole area ended up burning as part of the fire. Remember, these are piney woods. The pines are what basically burned that whole area. We had 2 deaths, which is actually pretty good. Could have been a lot worse. Almost 1,700 homes were destroyed, 36 businesses lost, over $325 million in losses because of the fire. Over 98% of the state park was destroyed by fire. And remember, the park is the habitat for the Houston toad, so a lot of the habitat for the Houston toad got damaged. The fire ended up burning for 36 days. And so dealing with all that. But we're also known for our floods. Bastrop, if you're not familiar where it is, we're about 30 miles east of Austin on the Colorado River. So when you hear reports that Austin flooded, more than likely Bastrop's going to flood too. We had 4 major floods in the 12 months between May 2015 and May 2016. So it comes, we're aware of it, but it's something you got to deal with. And those of you from Austin know that it only rains on Memorial Day and Halloween. The biggest floods seem to have occurred on those days. The Memorial Day flood in 2015 had 23 inches for the month. That was a storm where Wimberley got hit hard. You all are, where it basically kind of wiped out a good part of the town. And of course that came downstream and hit Bastrop. We had the fire before that. And so when the flood came, the dam at Bastrop State Park was breached. So, fires and floods, they got to go together. If you kind of watch California, some of the same thing always happens. They'll have a fire, then they'll have a big flood, mudslides, all those kinds of issues. Oh, and I will tell you, I'm in Bastrop on an interim basis. So it said interim. I am retired, and I intend to be retired, but I'll kind of do a short-term thing. One of their jobs is to provide me housing. The house they provide me is kind of like right on the bank. It actually is safely above the BFE, but it's right there. So when Harvey came, I was a little concerned. Halloween flood, 2014, they had a tornado that came through a part of Bastrop County. Another big fire, the Hidden Pines fire, came through October 15th. Halloween, there was a big fire on tax day in 2016. You can kind of see the pattern that's going on. Now, a lot of people asked about Hurricane Harvey. How did that affect us? And we actually fared fairly well. We had about 24 inches of rain, but was spread out over about 48 to 72 hours. So it was steady enough that we didn't really flood that bad. Now, just downstream of us in Smithville and LaGrange, they got hit pretty hard. So it was just a matter of luck, of geography, that we happened to fare well on Hurricane Harvey. Now, as it happened, a couple of days ago, I was at the City Managers Conference and got to sit with some of my friends. One's the manager of Rockport, one is the manager in Victoria, and one is the manager of Alvin. So we can kind of talk about all of the issues that happened because of that storm. Question came up about IT. What do you do about IT? We have a relationship with Rockport, kind of informally, that we kind of serve as each other's backup. So what happened was the Rockport IT department moved up to Bastrop, and they actually operated out of the Bastrop library. And so we ran the Rockport IT out of Bastrop for a week, at least a week or so. And I was a little skeptical of the cloud as well, but the cloud actually worked out pretty well because they ended up having access to all of their files. They could get to basically everything they needed. It's just the problem was City Hall was gone physically. The county courthouse was gone. Having to deal with all of that. Over 90% of the structures in Rockport were severely damaged or destroyed, and so they've got a long way to come back. Victoria was mainly a flooding issue, and of course over in Alvin by Houston was a flooding issue. City manager doesn't live in Alvin, she lives in Dickinson. Her house flooded up to almost the second floor, and she had to evacuate by boat from her second floor balcony. She could not get back to Alvin, so she ended up going to the Dickinson EOC and working out of the Dickinson EOC to kind of handle things as they went forward. But what I'm here to talk about is after the response, what now? How do you kind of dig yourself out? I like the new term that you don't bounce back, you bounce forward. There's always this big pressure to let me move in to where I was before, let me build back exactly like I was. You have to think that through very carefully, because you're basically just putting people back in harm's way sometimes, particularly if it's a flooding issue or something like that, or if they're on the beach and they've got storm surge. Now, for a tornado, you obviously can't predict the path of a tornado. That could happen anywhere, but you can require those higher building codes. Now, yes, a building code will not stop an EF4 or an EF5 tornado, but they are designed to handle a 1 or 2 tornado. So just having that additional building code standard in there and go out and inspect it, make sure it gets built that way, can be an important thing to do. And I realize that in a county situation, in a very small town situation, you always don't always have the resources to do that. And there's also a lot of political pressure. Hey, Joe, you've known me all your life. Why don't you just let me kind of slide by on this one? You kind of have to kind of stand up to some folks that you might not otherwise want to do. You need to organize your recovery efforts. I'll talk a little bit about that. The building codes. Because of the fires, we're interested in that wildland-urban interface, that area where the woods or the shrubs come up to where the houses are. And of course, the reason that people want to live in the Lost Pines is because it's so beautiful there. All those trees, but you'll see at the bottom, all those trees got burned away. And so if you let people build into that, and so we'll talk a little bit about how to approach that. Floodplains we've talked about, and I'll talk a little bit about climate adaptation. We've created our long-term recovery team. Its mission is to help low-income, underserved people to go through that process that they don't have. You'll notice all the partners that we have as part of our team, a lot of faith-based organizations, but also some, the Meadows Foundation, 7-Eleven, some other folks that you can kind of bring in to kind of help with resources and help with providing services to folks. And so they provide case management, they kind of organized home repairs, and a lot of faith-based organizations helped with that. But an important thing that I wanted to mention here was helping with spiritual and emotional care. Think about it. You've lost your home, your livelihood, obviously you're depressed. You got to deal with those issues. Another issue you got to deal with is anxiety, because you're always afraid of next time it rains, you're looking around, am I going to flood again? We put out a Facebook post today to say that there's a controlled burn at Camp Swift. So if you see smoke, don't worry, that's designed that way, but people automatically start reliving the disaster again and trying to deal with that, keep your eyes on that. I was going to say something about that, but it'll come back to me. One of the things that you might consider if you are fire prone is the FireWise Communities approach. Are you all familiar with FireWise Communities? It's a voluntary program. FireWise USA is a nonprofit, and they've partnered with the National Fire Protection Association. That's the guys that write the fire code. And the idea is to set certain zones around your house and to allow certain amounts of vegetation with each of those zones so that you don't allow a lot of flammable material right up to your house. You kind of get some of that away from you. We actually have one neighborhood in our community that has gone through the certification process. Like everybody has a certification process, so they've gone through that, but we're going to try to get more of those people to do that as well. One unintended consequence is that a big part of the area that was suffered under the fire was an area in our ETJ, was platted a long time ago, was not platted very well, and if you're familiar with Bastrop, it's called Tahitian Village. Someone was complaining about somebody's name. Well, all the street names are that long, at least 12 letters, because they're all supposed to be Tahitian sounding. And I don't think there was any thought laid out to how they laid out that subdivision. Well, in fact, we think they went to Tahiti for a vacation and designed it, and then came back and said, "Oh, here it is. Let's start selling lots." And unfortunately, a lot of the lots they sold were sight unseen to a lot of service members. And then they come back to the States and find out there's no streets, there's no water, no sewer. But one of the unintended consequences since then is we're finding a lot of people combining those lots back together and making some larger lots, which in effect is lowering the density, which is going to make us a little bit less vulnerable as we move forward. Let's go back. So I am a floodplain manager, so I'm very interested in protecting people from the hazards of flood, and I need you all to understand how inexact flood science is. You know, engineers will tell you, yes, it's this, but no, it's not. One thing you need to be aware of is that your flood rate maps are based on past information. It's not current information. So, you know, they're looking at history to find out, you know, what is the frequency of a certain storm. But frequency of storms seem to be changing, and that's not built into the flood maps. It's an insurance rate map, so it's based on existing risk. They don't look at the future. So how many houses are upstream from you now is all they look at. And so what happens when you build more houses upstream and you put more concrete down? All of that is not figured into the floodplain analysis. And I know in Texas you got to be a little careful about when you talk about climate change, but obviously something's happening. And so you need to be looking at maybe the climate's going to be different now than it was before. That's not built into the flood maps. They only update the flood maps when Congress gives them money. And right now they're about 10 years behind. So your flood maps are probably at least 10 years old. In Bastrop, we're working off of 2006, 2008 maps. So it's already been 10 years. So think about all that. And then FEMA, in their wisdom, allows you to build in the floodplain. They have an area in the center of the floodplain called the floodway. The floodway is to be kept open and free of obstruction to allow the 100-year flood to go through with no more than a 1-foot rise in the flood level. But they let you build on the fringe of the floodplain on the outside levels and fill it in. Say you got a volume of water coming down and you squeeze, it's the same volume of water and you squeeze it in, what's going to happen to the height? It's got to go up. So FEMA's regs automatically put a foot of water in everybody's house. So, you know, most cities in Texas have gone to a 1-foot freeboard, or more and more of them now require a 2-foot freeboard just to have a little bit more protection from what that rise in the flood level is going to be. Some cities have actually gone to prohibiting all development in the floodplain, but if you look at your floodplain, that's a lot of land. And so cities are trying to make that balance between, do we let people build in the floodplain or do we just try to protect them when they get there? These are some examples of, that's what a flood insurance rate map looks like. And by the way, that's my house right there. And then for those of you that might have the capabilities of having a geographic information system, a GIS, they also do the flood maps as a digital flood insurance rate model or a DFIRM, and then you can pop that into your GIS so you can have a lot more information. Sure.
We got official flood maps.
Yes.
Are there unofficial flood maps that are more, I don't know, probably a little bit more up to date?
Yes. And well, cities will end up paying for those themselves.
What organization actually provides stuff to?
The cities pay a consulting engineer to prepare those for them. And then as a flood administrator, I'm supposed to use the best engineering available. So I will tend to use those, but then they'll use the old official flood maps to determine what insurance rates they end up paying. So,
Even though they're not the same?
even though they're not the same. So. And a lot of times you have to revise the maps because the creek will be shown here and the floodplain will be shown over here. And they're not congruent, or you don't have enough topographic information to have a lot of detail in those. So, and then every time you develop in the floodplain, you're supposed to revise that as well. So there's a whole industry related to that. And then
Buyer beware.
right. And then one of the requirements of the flood insurance program is that if there is a federally insured mortgage, the mortgage company is supposed to require flood insurance. So how do they get that information? They don't have their own people. They hire a service company. Often it's in Tennessee or someplace else that'll say yay or nay. And their maps, it's not always accurate. So the best thing for you to do is to contact your local person and find out exactly where that line is. And the way it works, and this is kind of appropriate because the flood insurance program expired a couple of weeks ago. Congress, in their wisdom, hasn't gotten around to fixing it, but they have continued it on an interim basis. The way it works is that if the level of inundation that you're expected to get affects your premium. So if you're above the flood level, 100-year flood level, then your premium's pretty low. And yes, it's a myth that you don't have to live in the 100-year floodplain to buy flood insurance. Anybody can buy flood insurance, and I would encourage people to think about buying flood insurance because a large percentage, I've heard as much as 50 to 60% of the flood claims are actually outside of the designated 100-year floodplain. You know, it's house to house or street or something like that. And your homeowner's policy will not cover any damage caused from water coming in from outside your house. That's what flood insurance is about. As you get lower and lower under the flood level, your premium goes higher and higher. And then Congress, in their wisdom, has not kept up with what the actual costs are. So you may hear that the flood insurance program is going broke, and that's because they're paying a lot more than they're bringing in premiums. A couple of years ago, they tried to raise the premiums, and there was such backlash from everybody whose premiums jumped up so high that Congress said, oh, no, King's X, we're going to go back. That's one of the issues they're dealing with now is when they reauthorize the program, how do they set the insurance premiums? Anything else on floodplains? So, how do we move forward? You know, obviously looking at maybe some low impact development or what they sometimes call sustainable development. Don't let people build in harm's way. You know, keep them out. Keep them out of the floodplain, keep them out of the forest. That's easier said than done. You know, Texas has a very strong tradition of property rights. You've got to weigh those issues, and particularly small town and rural areas, they're particularly sensitive about, you know, how can you tell me what to do with my property? And yet they're the first ones at the door wanting you to pay their claim when they got flooded or burnt down. So you're always weighing that problem. Most people will, like I said, will either be, you have to be out of the floodway, but above the flood level, or move them out of the floodplain altogether. And a lot of cities now are getting to what are called stream bank buffers, where you go maybe an extra 40 or 50 feet beyond that for additional protection. You know, I had lots of people come to me and say, I bought my house next to the creek because it was so pretty, and now the bank is eroding and is affecting my house. City, come in and do something about it. And not my problem. I didn't make you live there, but you have to kind of deal with some of those political pressures. Better site planning. A traditional subdivision might be laid out like this, and my argument is that land developers and their engineers start with a clean sheet of paper on their drawing board. I guess that's dating myself. It's on a computer screen now. So they got this clean sheet of paper and they lay things out the most efficient way. Then they go out into the field and they clear the site to make it look like a clean sheet of paper. What if we had them kind of work with the property, kind of preserve the creeks? You don't get as many houses as you would over here, but it turns out that the cost per lot is lower because you have fewer streets and you don't have to build this massive drainage system. You know, not so much in rural areas, but, you know, most suburban areas, curb and gutter, well, you carry that curb and gutter water, you got to take it somewhere, and it's usually a pipe and stuff like that. You kind of save all that. And then it turns out that the lots adjacent to a preserved open space, you can sell for a higher price. fact, studies show that you can get as much as 20% more per lot. So actually the profit per lot on this program is much higher than you would get in a traditional site development. We have some education with the developers and the engineering community, but we're working on that. One of the things that you can do as part of flood protection is to do flood detention. It's not really the volume of water that's the problem, it's the peak flow. So, you know, when rain falls onto a field, it kind of soaks in and it kind of runs off at a fairly slow pace. And so the effect of the flood downstream is fairly low. Pave that with concrete or a roof and all those issues, water runs off very quickly. And so you end up with a high peak flow. So before development, it may have looked like that. After development, you got a peak like that. So one approach is to do detention or retention ponds. Detention would look something like that. It's dry during most days of the year, but when the storm comes, the pipe coming into the pond is big, the pipe going out of the pond is small. So it kind of collects all that water and then lets it out at a slower rate, so the peak is not as high as it was before. Those, sometimes people don't think those are too attractive. Actually, that's one of the more attractive ones I've seen. Most people want to have some detention or retention that make it an amenity. People will pay extra money to have that pond out there. You just have to be aware that there is a portion of the capacity of the pond above the normal water that's there for flood purposes. And so it's going to go up and down over time. Cluster or conservation subdivisions are becoming more and more of interest to folks. This might be a traditional rural subdivision, 2-acre lots, each on a septic tank. Life goes on. What if we took that same number of units on that site and kind of clustered them on 1-acre lots and then preserve the area around as open space? Got the same number of units, we've protected a lot of area, and the streams and stuff are all protected from flooding. Or even more, what if we allowed 1/2-acre lots? You could actually get more houses in. Now here you can't use septic tanks anymore. You're going to have some kind of alternate wastewater on-site sewer facility. The trick though is to make sure that you actually protect that open space through a ag easement or conservation easement, because you know as soon as they develop those houses, they're going to be back in saying, well, I want to develop houses over here, and you really haven't gained anything. Yes?
Like the difference between the first example and the third example, especially in a suburban area, in terms of what amount of water is retained or percolated through the natural system compared to, say, everything being paved over.
Yeah, well, obviously this area, there's a lot more that's going to run off at a lower rate than would have been with the more traditional kind of development. Now, you might say, you know, that's nice, it's in a textbook, where does it really happen? Town of Flower Mound up by Dallas-Fort Worth Airport has a few conservation subdivisions like this. And I can tell you that one of my projects as interim planning director in Bastrop is we are reevaluating what we allow to develop in our extraterritorial jurisdiction. You know, the charm of Bastrop is it's got the old traditional grid system streets downtown and a certain type of development that's there. And the suburban development pattern is not Bastrop. And so we want to make things uniquely Bastrop. So we're going to be working on a set of regulations to require that development in the extraterritorial jurisdiction set aside more of these conservation areas, look at a more hamlet grid system approach as opposed to the standard typical cookie cutter subdivision. Robert? So far it's been well accepted by the mayor and the city manager. We haven't quite walked it out to the development community yet. So now I think the public at large is going to be very supportive of it, but it's the development community that we're going to run into. And to some extent the county judge. He's kind of a real strong property rights. He thinks that there should be no regulations in the county. So I'm sure you've run across some of those. And like I said, we can argue about climate change all you want, but it's kind of naive or short-sighted not to at least prepare for it. Because if we say it's not real, what if we're wrong? So it might be better to plan for what might be coming, particularly, when Houston says they've had 2 or 3 500-year floods in the last 10 years, maybe something's there that we need to be looking at. Now, there's been this argument among the national planning community that, well, the reason the Houston flooded was because they have no zoning. And I kind of bristle at that because Houston had over 50 inches of rain in about a 72-hour period. Anywhere in the country would have flooded at that. Now, there are some things that Houston did wrong. They did allow development in some places that shouldn't have. But I think they're going to work through some of those issues. Another big complaint I've heard is, if you're familiar with Houston, there's 2 reservoirs upstream called Addicks and Barker. They're actually designed as detention ponds. And people said, well, the Corps caused the flooding because they released water. Those 2 reservoirs operated exactly as they were designed. The problem was the people downstream, and unfortunately some of the people upstream didn't plan for it. Some of the communities up there actually allowed people to build in the detention pond and then complained about getting flooded. So think about that. You had a question earlier? Okay. So what does climate change mean for Texas? And like I said, I'm not getting into what caused it or what we can do, globally about it, but how does it affect us in terms of looking at disasters? Inland areas, mainly it just means more extremes. We're going to have bigger droughts and then we're going to have bigger floods. And so we just need to plan for those 2 eventualities. So if I'm in a community that has fires and floods, it's just going to get worse all the way around. On the coast, we talk about sea level rise, but sea level rise is occurring. We can point to some communities. I've got friends in Virginia Beach, Virginia, where they have regular flooding now that they never used to have because the tidal levels have come up. Some areas of Florida are the same way. Some areas of Texas are kind of seeing some of that as well. There is a nice little tool called the Digital Coast Project, where if you live on the coast, you can use this tool to say, what if sea level rise was 1 foot? What would that mean? And they have mapped all the coast and shown exactly what areas would be inundated at each individual level. So state assistance, federal assistance for mitigation and response and recovery. Obviously we've talked about some of the immediate response assistance that's available. 2 lessons. One is document everything. Every dollar you spend, all the time you spend, make sure that you document that. There was some discussion earlier about ICS, and there's something called NIMS trading, and we always kind of worry about the emergency management folks and maybe public works folks being trained in that. The complaint I heard with some of my folks on the coast is they wish they had put their financial people through NIMS trading, because where they fell through was not having people keep track of all the bookkeeping with the idea that we've got to turn all this in. They wish they had done that. And then it's a reimbursement program. There's very little time where the government comes out and hands you a check, say go spend it. They are reimbursing you for what you have already spent. So you need to think about, where am I getting the money to spend? What budget am I robbing it from, or waiting for it to come back? And then be aware that sometimes that payback period is fairly long. I'm still hearing stories that some people around Houston are getting repaid for expenses from Ike, that they didn't have their paperwork together, this, that, or the other, and it just takes time. Other thing you're going to find during this response event is you're going to get a bunch of people from FEMA coming through the door. 1 a day for a week or so, and then they disappear. And then finally, you're going to get the one guy that you need to talk to, and he'll come in and he'll kind of walk you through the steps of what you need to do. But just be patient and be asking questions of what you need to do. We've talked about mitigation. How do we protect ourselves from future disasters? And from my city lens, I'm thinking of infrastructure. How do we harden that? Those kinds of things. Every time there is a presidential declaration, a portion of that, often about 10%, depending on the size of the disaster, is set aside for future mitigation activities. So what's the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program? You need to have a mitigation plan in place and approved. That can be a challenge sometimes, but in order to get money, you have to have that plan approved. And a lot of the risk and vulnerability stuff that you were asking about often is addressed in the mitigation plan. That's where it's often done. First, TDEM, the Governor's Office of the Department of Emergency Management, and then by FEMA. And here in Texas, it's FEMA Region 6. Now, I've kind of thought they were kind of nitpicky on their approval process. I was a planner, so when I first did it, I wanted to make it a part of my comprehensive plan, and the emergency management folks in Austin said, no, this is a grant application program. You can't put it in your comprehensive plan. I think they're getting a little bit more comfortable about integrating the two, but it's taken some time. And then I had trouble getting mine through FEMA, and so we had to have a consultation, and they made me change one word, and then they approved it. But once you get that done, then you have access to some of this mitigation programs. Now, obviously, you have to compete with everybody else in the world, but that gives you some opportunities. Tornadoes have been an issue here. One of the common uses for mitigation funds is the Safe Room program. You all familiar with safe rooms? A place to put in your house or in your yard. Old storm cellar is what, but now they're pretty high tech now. But anyway, there's funding available. Well, they will reimburse individuals for putting safe rooms in their buildings when they're rebuilding. Couple of things you might want to look for, make sure that you have the exact location of where that safe room is, because when you go back out to find people, the house is usually not, thing that you can recognize. So being able to go out with GPS or something like that. There are some companies that market safe rooms that are underground in your garage. Sounds okay until you come back out and there are cars and house and everything buried on top of that. So you might want to think about that too. Bastrop is using some of their money for sheltering facilities. We didn't have any formal shelter facilities, so both the city and the county are now building shelters. So next time we can help handle those. One of the things that we're doing with our shelter, we're trying to get a shelter, and from a manager standpoint, shelters are a pain, and you really don't want to get into that, but you have to do something. And manning those is a big part of that. And then the senior citizens came in and said, we need a new facility. Well, maybe we can work a deal. So what we're going to do is we're going to leave, and a shelter is not usually used only for a emergency. It's often used for something else over time. We're going to use ours as a senior citizens facility with the expectation that their members will be trained and will staff the facility. Now, obviously, they can't provide all the staffing, but they are additional people that might be able to help with that. Even if it's sometimes just to give somebody a hug, sometimes and who's better to do that than grandma? So I think that, that's kind of some of the things that we're trying to think out of the box. Yeah.
What kind of funding is available for the shelters? Is there a range?
On the shelters,
That you turned into the senior.
yeah, I don't recall what our grant was, but I can find out for you.
Okay.
The reimbursement for the safe rooms I want to say, is like $4,000 or $5,000, which doesn't pay for it all, but it's a good portion of it. One thing that you guys may not know is the state park system and those are all state employees, and when there's a disaster, they're all deployed as well. A lot of the people that were out in boats were Parks and Wildlife folks. When they see a storm coming, they canceled all the camping reservations at Bastrop State Park and let people who were evacuating out to use those facilities for free. So something I didn't know about. Now, it wasn't used as much as they kind of thought it would be, but it was there. Some temporary challenges. People move, particularly mobile homes and RV parks and stuff like that. They're often the ones down by the river. And they need to get out. They often kind of congregate in like the Walmart parking lot, which is that there. Or manufactured homes start appearing in odd places around town. And the problem, is temporary housing, that might be okay, but the temporary housing starts becoming permanent. And so dealing with that on a code enforcement basis, and it's really hard to tell somebody, hey, you got to get your illegal mobile home out of here, because that's where they're living. But that's one of the things that you kind of have to deal with. You've lost businesses, you've lost tax base. Earlier this morning, somebody talked about the appraisals, how that was might affect them. What they're finding on the coast is they've lost all their employees. All their employees have moved away, and so a lot of these businesses that want to reopen are having a hard time because there's nobody around. And of course, customers have left. Now, the good news from a city standpoint is there's often a couple of year lag between, if there's a disaster, it doesn't get appraised until the following January. The effect on the taxes received is another year. So it's not immediate from a city standpoint, but then you've got residents who have lost their homes and have gotten a tax bill on essentially nothing. They're not happy about that. There was a bill in the legislature this past session that would have allowed appraisal districts to do emergency appraisals in this situation, and for better or worse, it died as part of the bathroom debate, so you can think about that. Resistance to higher standards. Like I said, there's a lot of pressure to rebuild it as it was, not as it should be. You've got to kind of stand up and talk about, we're building for the future, not for the past. And there's a lot of good old boy development attitudes. Hey, I've always been able to do that, or that old city inspector said it was okay. That old city inspector has retired and gone somewhere else. And then, like I said, the mental health issue, and particularly anxiety. Now, response-wise, there was some discussion about the first responders. During a storm, everybody is in that situation. And so some of the folks on the coast were saying, if possible, give your folks a little bit of time before the storm to take care of their families. Don't force them to all come into the EOC or to their emergency station. Let them take care of their family first, but then they can come back not worrying about that. And then, as hard as it is, you got to rotate people off. Give them a refresher. And working 18 days, that's probably 10 days too long. And there are some resources that, like I said, with our agreement with Rockport, there are groups out there that, people can do your job, or at least kind of fill the position while you're gone to give you a little bit of time off while you're out. You were asking about, what about architects and engineers and stuff like that? Most of the professional associations developed groups to Texas Society of Architects put together a team to do building evaluations. You don't want to let people move into an unsafe building. They do those inspections. The Plan APA group has got a group together. We may end up doing something with Rockport, kind of dealing with. Now, from a planning standpoint, the most important thing as a recovery plan is, what does your comprehensive plan say? That's assuming you have a comprehensive plan or a master plan or something. The other nice thing about it is sometimes it's a clean slate to kind of start from scratch. A lot of our plans get built on what was there, so we got to live with that, and let's talk about what's going to develop outwards. This might be a chance to help you redevelop some areas, clean up some areas, to build the city you want to have be there. Just some resources. You got the federal and state organizations. Got the General Land Office because of some of the support that they provided along the coast. The GLO's kind of the Coastal Zone Management Organization. Jim talked a lot about APA. They have their Hazards Planning Center. The person that replaced Jim actually was at A&M for a while, so she has some experience in Texas. Also, the APA they have chapters like the Texas chapter, but they have divisions, which are kind of specialty organizations, and they have a division for hazard mitigation and disaster response. I think Jim mentioned the city planning assistance teams. You know, if you are wiped out or if you got a big problem, you can call them. They will send a team of experts in for a long weekend. ULI does kind of a similar RUDAT is what they call theirs, which is nice sometimes when you've got very little capacity, an ability to get some planning assistance. Some publications, Planning for Post-Disaster Recovery, that's Jim's book, so I felt obligated to put that up there. One of the things that APA does is what are called policy guides, things that APA takes to the federal legislature and the state legislatures. And there's two fairly recent ones. One is called the Hazard Mitigation Policy Guide, and the one that was adopted just a month or so ago, the Healthy Communities Policy Guide. Healthy communities, what does that have to do? Well, as we mentioned before, how we build our communities can affect our health. And there's more and more evidence of traditional suburban development is not healthy for us. Obesity, diabetes, all those kinds of issues. I tell people I'm the poster child for growing up in a suburb. So if you don't want to look like me, we ought to build our communities so you don't have to drive a car everywhere. That we put sidewalks in our communities. That we have places where you might want to walk to. That we plant trees along the streets to give you some shade while you're walking. All those kinds of issues. And then, as I mentioned, APA's Hurricane Harvey Task Force. We've also been touching, the governor appointed a special task force on terms of hurricane response. John Sharp is the one that's leading that, former president, or I guess still is the chancellor at A&M. And so we've been working with that group a little bit. And so the important thing to say is, and I'm right on time, just chill, just chill.
Don't shoot the messenger.
You are not the first to go through a disaster, and I was glad to hear that you all got some advice from Rockwall and Mesquite, that area that lived through a tornado. There have been other tornadoes that have gone through. One thing about Texans is we're independent, but we help each other. And a lot of times it just takes a phone call, or a lot of times they will even reach out to you to help you kind of work through this process. And with that, I've got 9 minutes and 30 seconds.
You're fine, Christian.
And Melissa, we can combine this with your section too. Just kind of last minute thoughts, wrap up, questions. Probably still have plenty of people out. Yeah, Chris?
Your resources up there, I noticed you didn't have the National Guard, which is a federally funded state usable agency. Is that normally brought into the game?
It's brought into the game when the governor says so. But typically it'll be a request, but you can ask for it. He may not give it, and he's usually going to make that decision on his own. Okay. And here in Texas, we have the Texas State Guard, which actually their headquarters or their big facility is right next to Bastrop, so Camp Swift.